The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Kandahar as CIA operative Sarah Chun checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The intel briefing had been clear. A high-value target would be moving through this sector at precisely 0800 hours. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was that she would be walking into what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated trap. Sarah had earned her reputation over 8 years of covert operations across 3 continents. Born to a Chinese immigrant father and Irish-American mother in Queens, she had learned early that being underestimated could be an advantage. Her slight build and unassuming appearance had allowed her to blend into crowds from Bangkok to Beirut, gathering intelligence that had prevented countless attacks on American interests. The safe house where she now waited had been compromised 3 days earlier, though headquarters seemed unaware of this fact. Sarah had noticed the subtle signs during her reconnaissance: fresh tire tracks in unusual patterns, the repositioning of street vendors, and, most telling of all, the absence of children playing in an area where they always gathered. These details painted a picture that her training had taught her to read like a book. Through the grimy window of the second-floor apartment, Sarah observed the street below with practiced eyes. 2 men in traditional Afghan dress sat at a tea stall that hadn't existed yesterday, their posture too rigid for casual customers. Across the street, a merchant appeared to be selling carpets. But his inventory was too neat, too organized for someone who had actually been conducting business. These weren't locals going about their daily routines. These were professionals setting up a kill box. Her radio crackled softly with an incoming transmission from her handler, Agent Marcus Webb, operating from a secure facility 200 miles away. Webb had been running operations in this region for over a decade, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many good people die in situations exactly like this one. The mission parameters were simple in concept but deadly in execution. Intercept a Taliban commander known as the Engineer, who was responsible for the sophisticated roadside bombs that had killed dozens of American soldiers. Sarah's earpiece buzzed with Webb's familiar voice. "Raven, this is Control. Target is mobile and approaching your position. Estimate arrival in 15 minutes. Navy SEAL Team 6 is standing by for extraction once you have eyes on the package." The clinical language of the mission couldn't mask the underlying tension. Everyone knew this operation was high risk, but the intelligence the Engineer possessed could save countless lives. What Webb didn't know, and what Sarah was beginning to understand, was that the Engineer had no intention of walking into their trap. Instead, he had set one of his own. The man was brilliant at psychological warfare, understanding that the Americans would never be able to resist the opportunity to capture him alive. He had leaked just enough information to make the intelligence seem credible while ensuring that Sarah would be the one walking into danger. Sarah moved away from the window and began her pre-operation routine, checking her concealed weapons and communications equipment. Her primary weapon was a modified Glock 19 carried in a specially designed holster that allowed for quick access while maintaining complete concealment. Secondary weapons included a ceramic knife that wouldn't trigger metal detectors and a small explosive device designed to destroy sensitive equipment if capture became inevitable. The building where she waited was a 3-story structure typical of the area, with multiple exit routes that she had memorized during her initial reconnaissance. The ground floor housed a small bakery that served as her cover story, while the upper floors contained apartments rented by families who had no idea that their building had become the center of an international intelligence operation. Sarah had chosen this location specifically because it provided multiple escape routes while maintaining clear sight lines to the target area. As she reviewed her mental map of the surrounding streets, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The family that lived in the apartment directly below had left earlier than usual, carrying more belongings than would be normal for a simple shopping trip. The father had avoided eye contact as they passed in the hallway, and the mother had hurried the children along in a way that suggested urgency rather than routine. These were the behaviors of people who had been warned to leave. Her training kicked in as she processed this new information. If the local family had been evacuated, it meant that someone with detailed knowledge of the operation had tipped them off. This suggested either a leak in the intelligence chain or, more likely, that the Engineer had penetrated their operation from the beginning. Sarah found herself in the classic intelligence nightmare. She was the one being hunted while believing she was the hunter. The radio crackled again with an update from Control. Raven, we're picking up increased chatter on Taliban frequencies. Recommend you maintain position and wait for target confirmation. Webb's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there earlier, suggesting that he too was beginning to sense that something was wrong with the operation. The increased radio traffic could indicate that enemy forces were coordinating a response to their presence. Sarah made a decision that would prove crucial in the coming hours. Instead of maintaining her assigned position, she moved to the building's roof, where she could observe the entire area while maintaining radio contact. From this elevated position, she could see what had been invisible from the second floor, a coordinated pattern of movement that suggested at least a dozen hostile operatives taking positions around her building. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a compromised operation. It was a sophisticated ambush designed to capture or kill a CIA operative. The engineer wasn't planning to show up at all. He was somewhere else entirely, probably watching the operation unfold through the eyes of his subordinates. Sarah was the real target, and she had walked directly into their trap. From her rooftop position, Sarah could see the full scope of the tactical situation. 2 pickup trucks had appeared at opposite ends of the street, positioned to block any ground-level escape routes. The men she had observed earlier were now openly carrying weapons, their casual disguises abandoned in favor of tactical efficiency. Most concerning of all, she could see additional operatives moving through buildings on adjacent streets, creating a perimeter that would make escape increasingly difficult. The temperature was rising as the morning sun climbed higher, and Sarah felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Her tactical vest was designed to be lightweight and concealable, but in the growing heat, it felt like a furnace. She knew that physical discomfort was the least of her problems. Staying focused and alert would be the difference between completing her mission and becoming another casualty statistic. Webb's voice crackled through her earpiece again. This Sarah's decision to take offensive action rather than wait for extraction was based on years of experience in similar situations. She understood that surprise was often the most effective weapon available to an outnumbered operative, and the enemy would least expect an attack from someone they believed to be trapped. Her plan was risky, but it offered better odds than passively waiting to be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Moving carefully across the rooftop, Sarah positioned herself above the alley where she had identified the enemy's weakest point in their perimeter. 2 operatives were stationed there, probably assuming that the narrow space and high walls would make it an unlikely escape route. They were correct in that assessment, but they had failed to consider that it might serve as an entry point for a counterattack. The first challenge was reaching ground level without being detected by the sentries posted throughout the area. Sarah had noticed during her initial reconnaissance that the building's fire escape had been damaged in a recent bombing, leaving a gap between the second floor and the alley below. What appeared to be an obstacle could actually serve as an advantage, since the enemy wouldn't expect anyone to attempt such a dangerous descent. Sarah secured a length of climbing rope to the roof's edge and began her descent into the alley. The rope was military-grade paracord that could support several times her body weight. But the challenge wasn't the equipment. It was maintaining silence while moving past windows where additional enemy operatives might be stationed. Each floor she passed required careful timing to avoid creating shadows or sounds that might alert the hostiles inside. The 2 operatives in the alley were positioned to watch the main thoroughfares rather than looking up at the buildings around them. This was a classic tactical error that Sarah had seen enemy forces make repeatedly. They focused on the obvious threats while ignoring the 3-dimensional nature of urban combat. Sarah's training had emphasized that in cities, threats could come from any direction, including directly above. As she reached the second-floor level, Sarah could hear the 2 men below speaking in hushed Pashto. Her language training allowed her to understand enough of the conversation to confirm her worst fears. They weren't just planning to capture her. They intended to use her as bait to draw in additional American forces. The engineer's plan was more sophisticated than she had initially realized. Sarah completed her descent and crouched behind a pile of rubble at the alley's edge, studying her targets. Both men appeared to be experienced fighters, carrying their weapons with the confidence of soldiers who had seen extensive combat. They wore traditional Afghan clothing that concealed modern body armor, and their equipment suggested they were part of a well-funded and professionally trained organization. The element of surprise would only last for seconds once she initiated contact, so Sarah's approach had to be flawlessly executed. She drew her ceramic knife while keeping her pistol ready for immediate use. The knife would eliminate the first target silently, while the pistol would handle the second before he could raise an alarm. Success depended on speed, precision, and the enemy's continued assumption that she was still trapped on the upper floors. Sarah moved with the fluid grace that came from years of training and real-world experience. Her first target never saw her coming. The ceramic blade found its mark before he could react. The second operative began to turn at the sound of his companion falling, but Sarah's Glock was already trained on him. 2 suppressed shots center mass ended the threat before he could cry out or reach for his radio. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 seconds, but Sarah knew that discovery was inevitable once the 2 sentries failed to check in with their command structure. She had perhaps 5 minutes before their absence would be noticed, and 10 minutes before search teams would begin sweeping the area systematically. The clock was now working against her in a very direct way. Sarah quickly searched the bodies, recovering additional ammunition and a radio that would allow her to monitor enemy communications. The radio chatter confirmed that the surrounding forces were indeed coordinating a systematic search, but they still believed she was somewhere inside the original building. This misconception gave her a temporary advantage that she intended to exploit fully. Moving deeper into the network of alleys that connected the older parts of the city, Sarah began implementing the second phase of her escape plan. Rather than trying to reach the predetermined extraction point, she was heading for a location that she had identified during her initial reconnaissance, but hadn't reported to her handlers. Sometimes the best hiding places were those that existed outside official planning. The old hammam, or bathhouse, had been abandoned since the fighting intensified in this district. Its complex layout of chambers and passages made it ideal for someone who needed to disappear quickly, while its cultural significance meant that it was unlikely to be destroyed during military operations. Sarah had explored the building 3 days earlier, mapping its interior and identifying multiple exit routes. As she moved through the maze of narrow streets, Sarah could hear the sound of vehicles and shouting voices behind her. The enemy had discovered the bodies in the alley and was now actively hunting for her. The systematic way they were conducting their search suggested military training and experience with urban operations. These weren't just local fighters, they were professionals. Sarah's radio intercepted increasingly frantic communications as the enemy forces tried to coordinate their response to her escape. The engineer himself had apparently arrived to take personal command of the operation, and his voice could be heard issuing precise orders for the deployment of additional assets. His English was accented but clear, indicating education and exposure to Western military doctrine. The bathhouse entrance was concealed behind a collapsed wall that appeared impassable from the street. Sarah had discovered during her earlier visit that the rubble could be moved to create a narrow opening, invisible to casual observation but large enough for a single person to pass through. She slipped inside and immediately began repositioning the debris to conceal her entry point. Inside the abandoned building, Sarah felt the temperature drop as thick stone walls blocked the morning sun. The interior was a maze of chambers that had once accommodated dozens of bathers, connected by passages that curved and twisted according to the architectural principles of traditional Islamic design. The complex layout that made the building beautiful also made it an excellent defensive position. Sarah moved to the central chamber and established a defensive position that would allow her to observe multiple approach routes while maintaining radio contact with control. The thick walls would provide protection from small arms fire, while the multiple exit routes meant that she couldn't be easily trapped if the enemy discovered her location. For the first time since the operation began, she felt that she had some control over her tactical situation. Her radio crackled with Webb's voice, tense with concern. "Raven, we lost your signal for several minutes. What's your status?" Sarah's movement through the city had taken her through areas where radio communications were unreliable, but she was now in a position where she could maintain contact with her handlers while remaining hidden from enemy forces. "Control, this is Raven. I've displaced from the original position and am currently in a defensible location. Enemy forces are conducting an active search, but I believe I can maintain concealment until extraction becomes available. Sarah's report was deliberately vague about her exact location, since she couldn't be certain that enemy forces weren't monitoring American communications. Webb's response carried both relief and frustration. Raven, SEAL Team 6 is 15 minutes out, but we need a clear landing zone for extraction. Current hostilities in your area make helicopter operations extremely dangerous. The subtext was clear. Sarah would need to either reach a safer extraction point or find a way to reduce the enemy threat before the SEALs could safely insert into the area. Sarah studied her tactical situation and realized that she might have an opportunity to turn the tables on her pursuers. The enemy's forces were spread throughout the district searching for her, which meant they were exposed and vulnerable to the kind of asymmetric attacks that she had been trained to conduct. Instead of simply hiding until extraction, she could actively hunt the hunters. The radio she had recovered from the alley was providing continuous updates on enemy positions and search patterns. Sarah could hear the engineer directing his forces with the precision of someone accustomed to command, but his very involvement in tactical details created an opportunity. If she could identify his location and either capture or eliminate him, the entire operation would collapse. Sarah's training had emphasized that the most effective operations were often those that achieved objectives beyond the original mission parameters. She had been sent to intercept the engineer, and while the circumstances had changed dramatically, the core objective remained achievable. The fact that he had come to personally oversee her capture meant that he was now within her operational area. The sound of vehicles moving through the nearby streets indicated that the enemy was bringing additional resources to bear on the search. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of motorcycle engines, which suggested that they were deploying rapid response teams to investigate any reports of contact. The level of resources being committed to her capture indicated just how valuable the engineer considered this operation. Sarah's finger paused on the trigger as her tactical mind processed the full implications of taking the shot. While eliminating the engineer would complete her primary mission, it would also turn her current concealed position into a death trap. The dozens of enemy operatives in the street below would immediately converge on the bathhouse, and even her carefully planned escape routes might not be sufficient to evade such overwhelming numbers. Instead of firing, Sarah made a decision that demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had made her one of the CIA's most effective operatives. She would capture the engineer alive, using him as both a source of intelligence and a bargaining chip for her own extraction. The plan required her to get close enough to take him prisoner without alerting his bodyguards, but it offered the possibility of completing the mission while dramatically improving her chances of survival. Sarah moved through the bathhouse to an exit that would place her in the covered marketplace adjacent to where the engineer was directing operations. The market had been largely abandoned since the fighting intensified, but its maze of stalls and passages would provide concealment for her approach. More importantly, the civilian nature of the location might cause the engineer's security team to lower their guard slightly. The covered market was a remnant of Kandahar's more peaceful past, when merchants from across Central Asia gathered to trade everything from precious stones to exotic spices. Now the empty stalls stood as silent witnesses to the conflict that had consumed the region. Sarah moved through the shadows cast by abandoned awnings and overturned tables, her footsteps muffled by dust and debris. Through gaps in the market's outer wall, Sarah could observe the engineer's command post while remaining invisible to his security team. He was clearly frustrated by his force's failure to locate her, repeatedly checking his watch and speaking rapidly into his radio. His body language suggested someone accustomed to success who was genuinely puzzled by the current situation. Sarah studied the security arrangement around the engineer and identified both strengths and weaknesses in his protection. For bodyguards maintained a loose perimeter around him, positioned to observe potential threats from the obvious directions. However, their focus on external threats meant they were paying less attention to the buildings immediately adjacent to their position, particularly structures that appeared to be abandoned. The engineer's position next to his command vehicle suggested that he was preparing to relocate, probably to a more secure location where he could coordinate the search without personal risk. Sarah realized that she had a narrow window of opportunity before her target moved beyond reach. The next few minutes would determine whether her mission ended in success or failure. Sarah's approach required her to cross approximately 50 meters of open ground while remaining undetected by trained professionals who were actively alert for threats. Her plan relied on misdirection and timing, using the enemy's own assumptions about her location to mask her actual movement. The key was to approach from a direction that the security team would consider least likely. Moving to the market's eastern edge, Sarah positioned herself behind an overturned cart that provided both concealment and a clear view of her target. The engineer was now standing with his back partially toward her position, studying a map that one of his subordinates had spread across the hood of the command vehicle. His attention was focused on identifying buildings where Sarah might be hiding, never considering that she might be approaching him. Sarah drew her ceramic knife and prepared to move. The weapon was designed to penetrate body armor while remaining undetectable by standard security screening, making it ideal for close-quarters operations in hostile territory. More importantly, its silent nature would allow her to neutralize the engineer's immediate security without alerting the broader force to her presence. The first challenge was crossing the open space between the market and the command vehicle without being spotted by any of the dozens of enemy operatives in the area. Sarah had observed their patrol patterns and identified a brief window when the guard's attention would be focused elsewhere. She would have less than 30 seconds to complete her approach and initiate contact. Sarah waited for the optimal moment, then moved with the fluid precision of a predator. Her training had emphasized that speed and decisiveness were often more effective than elaborate tactics, particularly when operating alone behind enemy lines. She covered the distance to the command vehicle before any of the security team realized she was there. The first bodyguard never saw her coming. Sarah's knife found its mark before he could raise an alarm, and she immediately turned toward the second guard. The man was beginning to react to his companion's fall when Sarah's blade ended his ability to threaten her mission. Two down, with the engineer still unaware that his security had been compromised. The third bodyguard was positioned on the far side of the command vehicle, his attention focused on observing a building where he apparently believed Sarah might be hiding. Sarah moved around the vehicle with cat-like silence, using its bulk to mask her approach. The man died without ever understanding that his assumptions about the threat's location had proven fatal. The fourth and final bodyguard was the most alert of the group, and he began to turn toward Sarah just as she eliminated his colleague. There was no time for the silent approach that had worked with the others. Sarah drew her suppressed pistol and fired twice center mass. The subsonic ammunition and integral silencer kept the shots quiet enough that they didn't immediately alert the broader enemy force. The engineer himself was the last to realize what was happening. He turned from his map to find Sarah standing beside his command vehicle with her pistol trained on his center mass. His eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and professional respect as he realized that the trap he had so carefully constructed had been turned against him. The hunter had become the hunted. "Don't move," Sarah said quietly in accented Pashto, demonstrating her linguistic training while keeping her weapon steady. "Your bodyguards are dead, and you're coming with me." The engineer's hands moved slowly away from his body, indicating his understanding that resistance would be futile. He was clearly a professional who understood when tactical situations had shifted beyond his control. The engineer studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent years evaluating threats and opportunities. "You are not what I expected," he said in heavily accented English, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. The intelligence reports described a typical American operative, not someone capable of such innovation. Sarah kept her weapon trained on him, while quickly searching his person for concealed weapons or communication devices. She found a pistol, which she removed and tossed aside, along with a sophisticated radio that she switched off to prevent his forces from tracking his location through electronic means. The search also revealed several documents that appeared to contain intelligence information, which she secured for later analysis. "We're going to walk very slowly toward that alley," Sarah instructed, indicating the narrow passage she had used earlier in her escape. "Your men are still searching for me in the buildings, which gives us a few minutes before they realize what's happened. Try to escape or call for help, and you'll join your bodyguards." The engineer nodded his understanding and began moving in the direction Sarah indicated. His compliance was probably based on professional calculation rather than fear. He understood that his value as a prisoner meant he was unlikely to be killed as long as he cooperated. However, he also understood that any attempt to escape would eliminate that protection. As they moved toward the alley, Sarah could hear the continuing radio chatter from enemy forces throughout the district. The search was proceeding according to the pattern the engineer had established, with teams methodically clearing buildings while maintaining perimeter security. None of the searchers suspected that their commander had been captured and was being moved toward an extraction point. Sarah's radio crackled with Webb's voice. "Raven, SEAL Team 6 is 10 minutes out and requesting confirmation of your extraction coordinates. We need to know where to establish the pickup zone." Sarah realized that she now had additional considerations beyond her own survival. She needed to ensure that her prisoner could be safely transported to a location where his intelligence value could be fully exploited. "Control, this is Raven," she responded quietly, maintaining her grip on the engineer while speaking into her microphone. "I have secured the primary target and require immediate extraction. Recommend LZ Bravo as the pickup point." LZ Bravo was a schoolyard 6 blocks away that would provide sufficient space for helicopter operations while being far enough from the current search area to avoid immediate enemy response. Webb's surprise was evident in his voice. "Raven, confirm you have the primary target in custody?" The success of Sarah's improvised operation clearly exceeded the expectations of everyone involved in the mission. What had begun as a potential disaster was turning into one of the most successful intelligence coups of the entire deployment. "Affirmative, Control. Package is secured and ready for transport." Sarah used the clinical language of intelligence operations to mask her own amazement at how the situation had developed. Less than an hour earlier, she had been trapped in what appeared to be an impossible situation. Now she was escorting one of America's most wanted enemies toward a rendezvous with extraction forces. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder as Sarah guided the engineer through the final stretch of alleys leading to the extraction point. The schoolyard they were approaching had been selected specifically for its clear approach lanes and multiple exit routes. But those same features that made it ideal for helicopter operations also made it visible to enemy forces throughout the district. Sarah knew they would be exposed and vulnerable during the pickup operation. The engineer had remained silent during their movement, but Sarah could sense his growing tension as they approached what he clearly recognized as an extraction zone. His steps became slightly more hesitant, and she noticed his eyes scanning for opportunities to break free or signal his location to the forces that were undoubtedly searching for him. Professional soldiers understood that the moment of extraction was often when prisoners made their most desperate escape attempts. "Keep moving," Sarah commanded quietly, maintaining pressure with her pistol while staying alert for any signs of enemy activity in the surrounding buildings. The schoolyard was now visible through a gap in the perimeter wall, an open space that seemed impossibly exposed after the concealment of the narrow alleys. Once they entered that clearing, they would be visible to anyone watching from the multi-story buildings that surrounded the area. Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from the SEAL team commander. "Raven, this is Thunder 1-6. We have visual on the LZ and are beginning our approach. Be advised, we're seeing movement in buildings around the pickup zone that suggests hostile observation." The professional tone couldn't disguise the obvious concern. Landing a helicopter in a potentially hostile area while extracting personnel was one of the most dangerous operations in military aviation. The engineer seized on this moment of divided attention to make his move. He suddenly twisted away from Sarah's grip and lunged toward a pile of rubble that would provide cover from her weapon. His movement was quick and well-coordinated, indicating military training and experience with escape and evasion techniques. For a moment, it appeared that Sarah's carefully executed capture operation might unravel at the last possible second. Sarah's training took over as she pursued the engineer across the uneven terrain. Rather than risking a shot that might miss and alert every enemy force in the area, she tackled him from behind, using her momentum to drive him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of both of them, but Sarah recovered first and quickly re-established control with her weapon trained on his head. "That was your one attempt," she said breathlessly, her professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal the stress of the past hour. "Try it again, and I'll save everyone the trouble of interrogating you." The engineer nodded his understanding, apparently convinced that further resistance would indeed prove fatal. His escape attempt had been professional and well executed, but ultimately unsuccessful. The helicopter was now clearly visible above the rooftops, a massive black shape against the morning sky that represented both salvation and vulnerability. MH-60 Black Hawks were formidable machines, but they became sitting ducks when landing in hostile territory. The SEAL team aboard would be as exposed as Sarah and her prisoner during the critical moments of the pickup operation. Sarah's radio buzzed with an urgent transmission from control. "Raven, we're picking up increased radio traffic that suggests enemy forces have identified your general location. Recommend immediate extraction before they can coordinate a response." Webb's voice carried the tension of someone watching the operation unfold from a remote location, aware that every second of delay increased the danger to everyone involved. The schoolyard gate stood open ahead of them, revealing the dusty playground where children had played before the fighting made such normalcy impossible. Sarah could see the landing zone markers that the advance team had placed, barely visible strips of reflective tape that would guide the helicopter pilot to the optimal touchdown point. The next few minutes would test every aspect of her training and experience. "Move toward the center of the yard," Sarah instructed the engineer, keeping her weapon ready while scanning the surrounding buildings for signs of enemy activity. The windows of the adjacent structures seemed to stare down at them like empty eyes, any one of which could conceal a sniper or rocket-propelled grenade team. Urban extraction operations were nightmares precisely because threats could emerge from any direction without warning. The helicopter was now descending toward the landing zone, its rotor wash creating clouds of dust that reduced visibility and made communication difficult. Sarah could see the crew chief hanging out of the side door, his helmet-mounted night vision goggles sweeping the perimeter for threats. The SEALs would fast rope down to establish security while she and her prisoner moved to the aircraft for extraction. The engineer suddenly stopped moving and raised his hands above his head in a gesture that seemed like surrender, but felt wrong to Sarah's experienced instincts. His body language suggested someone who was preparing for action rather than giving up, and she realized that he might be signaling to forces that were positioned to attack the extraction team. Professional soldiers didn't give up this easily, especially when rescue seemed so close. Sarah's suspicions were confirmed when muzzle flashes erupted from 3 different buildings around the schoolyard. The enemy forces that had been tracking them had finally identified their location and were attempting to prevent the extraction through direct fire. Bullets sparked off the concrete around them as Sarah grabbed the engineer and dragged him toward the minimal cover provided by an overturned table. The SEAL team responded immediately to the hostile fire, with the helicopter's door gunners laying down suppressive fire while the aircraft continued its descent to the landing zone. The distinctive sound of M240 machine guns filled the air as the crew worked to neutralize the enemy positions and protect the extraction operation. Sarah could see brass casings falling like deadly rain as the gunners engaged multiple targets. "Raven, we're taking effective fire from multiple positions," came the voice of Thunder 16 over the radio. "Can you identify hostile locations for our gunners?" Sarah looked around the schoolyard and quickly identified the 3 buildings from which enemy fire was originating. She passed the information to the SEAL commander, who immediately relayed targeting data to his door gunners. The fire from the surrounding buildings intensified as more enemy fighters joined the battle. Sarah realized that this was likely the engineer's entire security force, converging on the schoolyard in a desperate attempt to prevent his capture. What had begun as a covert operation was now a full-scale firefight in the middle of a populated district, with civilian casualties becoming an increasing concern. Sarah made a tactical decision that demonstrated both her field experience and her understanding of the broader strategic situation. Instead of simply protecting her prisoner while waiting for extraction, she began returning fire at the enemy positions, using her superior training and equipment to neutralize specific threats. Her suppressed rifle was nearly invisible to the enemy fighters, allowing her to engage them without revealing her exact position. The engineer watched this development with obvious professional interest, apparently impressed by Sarah's tactical skills and decision-making under pressure. "You are much better than the intelligence report suggested," he said during a brief lull in the firing. "Perhaps we underestimated American capabilities in this region." His comment was both a compliment and an admission that his forces had been outmatched by a single operative. The helicopter finally touched down in the center of the schoolyard, its rotors continuing to turn as the crew prepared for immediate departure. Four SEALs fast-roped down to establish a security perimeter, their advanced equipment and training immediately evident as they took positions around the landing zone. Sarah felt a surge of relief as professional reinforcements finally arrived to support her extraction. "Raven, this is Thunder 1-6 on the ground," came the voice of the SEAL team leader through her earpiece. "We have security established. Move to the bird with your package." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began moving toward the helicopter with the engineer, staying low to avoid the enemy fire that continued to pour down from the surrounding buildings. The distance to the helicopter seemed much greater under fire than the helicopter's steady rhythm gradually replaced the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the extraction as Sarah finally allowed herself to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. 20 minutes earlier, she had been trapped in what appeared to be an impossible situation, surrounded by hostile forces and facing capture or death. Now she sat across from one of America's most wanted enemies, watching the Afghan landscape pass below through the aircraft's armored windows. The engineer remained silent during the flight, but Sarah could see his mind working as he evaluated his new circumstances. Professional soldiers understood that capture was always a possibility in their line of work, and his calm demeanor suggested someone who had considered this scenario and prepared for it psychologically. His cooperation during the extraction had probably saved his life, since resistance would have given the SEALs justification to eliminate him as a threat. Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from control as they approached the forward operating base. Webb's voice carried a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction that the operation had exceeded all expectations. "Raven, outstanding work. The intelligence value of your package cannot be overstated. Prepare for immediate debriefing upon arrival at the FOB." The clinical language couldn't mask the obvious excitement at headquarters about the potential intelligence windfall. The SEAL team leader, whose call sign was Hammer, leaned toward Sarah to be heard over the helicopter's engine noise. "Ma'am, I've been running operations in this sector for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off back there. Walking into their trap and turning it around to capture their commander? That's going to become a case study at Quantico." His praise carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how difficult and dangerous the operation had been. Sarah nodded her appreciation for the compliment while continuing to observe the engineer. During their brief interaction, she had gained insights into his personality and methods that would prove valuable during interrogation. He was clearly intelligent and well-educated, speaking multiple languages and demonstrating familiarity with Western military doctrine. More importantly, his reaction to being captured suggested someone who might be willing to cooperate if approached correctly. The forward operating base appeared ahead of them, a sprawling complex of buildings and defensive positions carved out of the harsh Afghan landscape. Sarah could see the landing pad where intelligence personnel were already waiting to take custody of the engineer and begin the process of extracting information that could save countless American and Allied lives. The successful completion of her mission would have ramifications far beyond this single operation. As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Sarah reflected on the series of decisions that had transformed a failed operation into a spectacular success. Her willingness to abandon the original plan when circumstances changed, her decision to take offensive action rather than wait passively for help, and her improvised capture of the engineer had all required split-second judgments under extreme pressure. The margin between success and catastrophic failure had been measured in seconds and inches. The aircraft touched down with a solid thump, and immediately the base personnel moved forward to secure the engineer and escort him to the interrogation facility. Sarah watched as her prisoner was transferred to the custody of intelligence specialists who would spend the coming weeks extracting every piece of useful information from his knowledge base. The man who had orchestrated dozens of attacks against American forces would now become a source of intelligence to prevent future attacks. Webb was waiting for Sarah as she climbed down from the helicopter, his weathered face showing obvious relief that she had survived what everyone had assumed would be a suicide mission. "Sarah, I've been running operations for 15 years, and I've never had an agent walk into a trap and come out with the target in custody. How the hell did you pull that off?" His question was both professional curiosity and genuine amazement at the outcome. "The enemy made the same mistake that most people make when dealing with Americans," Sarah replied, accepting a bottle of water from one of the intelligence personnel. "They assumed that being outnumbered meant being defeated. They forgot that we're trained to think tactically even when the situation looks impossible. Once I realized what was happening, it became a matter of using their assumptions against them." The debriefing would take several hours as intelligence analysts worked to extract every detail of Sarah's observations and interactions with enemy forces. Her report would become part of the official record of the operation, but, more importantly, it would provide insights into enemy tactics and capabilities that could be used to plan future missions. The intelligence value of her first-hand observations was almost as significant as the capture of the engineer himself. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's senior intelligence analyst, approached Sarah with a tablet containing preliminary questions for the debriefing. "Agent Chun, we need to understand exactly how the engineer was operating in this sector. Your observations about his security arrangements, communication methods, and operational patterns could help us identify and target similar high-value individuals throughout the region." Foster's academic background in Middle Eastern studies made her particularly effective at analyzing the cultural and psychological aspects of enemy operations. As they walked toward the debriefing facility, Sarah noticed the increased activity throughout the base that indicated her successful mission had already triggered follow-up operations. Intelligence personnel were coordinating with military planners to exploit the information that would be extracted from the engineer, while communication specialists were updating other agencies about the successful capture. The ripple effects of her morning's work would continue for months. The debriefing room was a sterile environment designed to eliminate distractions while intelligence analysts extracted every detail of an operative's observations and experiences. Sarah had participated in hundreds of such sessions over her career, but this one felt different because of the extraordinary nature of the operation. Very few agents had ever successfully turned a trap into a capture operation while operating alone behind enemy lines. Webb began the formal debriefing by establishing the timeline of events from Sarah's arrival at the safe house to her extraction from the schoolyard. His questions were detailed and methodical, designed to create a complete picture of enemy capabilities and tactics that other operatives might encounter in similar situations. The information would be analyzed, cross-referenced with other intelligence, and used to update operational procedures throughout the theater. "Let's start with your initial observations at the safe house," Webb said, activating the recording equipment that would preserve Sarah's account for future analysis. "What first indicated to you that the operation might be compromised?" Sarah's answer would help other operatives recognize the subtle signs of a compromised operation before walking into a similar trap. Sarah described the environmental indicators that had suggested enemy surveillance, the altered patterns of civilian activity, the repositioning of street vendors, and, most significantly, the absence of children in areas where they normally played. The enemy was professional enough to clear civilians from the area before initiating their operation, but they didn't understand that the absence of normal activity is just as noticeable as the presence of suspicious activity, she explained. Dr. Foster interrupted with a question about the engineer's personal characteristics and behavior during his capture. "Did he seem surprised by your tactics, or did his reactions suggest that he had anticipated the possibility of being outmaneuvered?" Understanding enemy psychology and adaptability was crucial for planning future operations against similar targets. "He was definitely surprised by the tactical situation, but he adapted quickly once he understood what had happened," Sarah replied. His comments suggested that their intelligence about American capabilities was incomplete or outdated. They expected conventional responses to conventional tactics, but they hadn't prepared for asymmetric countermeasures. This observation would prove valuable for planning deception operations designed to exploit enemy assumptions. The debriefing continued for 3 hours as analysts explored every aspect of Sarah's experience, from her initial reconnaissance of the area to her final observations during the helicopter extraction. Each detail would be analyzed and compared with other intelligence to build a more complete picture of enemy operations and capabilities. The information would ultimately be used to save lives and prevent attacks against American interests. As the formal debriefing concluded, Webb leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah with the expression of someone who was still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "Sarah, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Intelligence Cross for this operation. What you accomplished today will be studied and taught for years to come. You turned what should have been a disaster into one of our most significant intelligence victories in this theater." Sarah accepted the recognition with the professional demeanor that had characterized her entire career, but privately she felt a deep satisfaction at having successfully completed an impossible mission. The capture of the engineer would provide intelligence that could prevent countless future attacks, while the successful escape from his trap would serve as proof that American operatives could adapt and overcome even the most sophisticated enemy planning. The long-term implications of the operation would extend far beyond the immediate intelligence value of the engineer's capture. His organization would be severely disrupted by the loss of their leader and the compromise of their operational security. More importantly, other enemy commanders would be forced to reconsider their assumptions about American capabilities and tactics, potentially making them more cautious and less effective in future operations. That evening, as Sarah prepared her final report on the mission, she reflected on the series of decisions and circumstances that had led to such an extraordinary outcome. The operation had demonstrated that individual skill, tactical flexibility, and the willingness to take calculated risks could overcome seemingly impossible odds. It had also proven that America's intelligence operatives were capable of innovation and adaptation that could surprise even the most sophisticated enemies. The story of Sarah Chen's escape from the engineer's trap and her successful capture of one of America's most wanted enemies would become legendary within the intelligence community. More importantly, it would serve as inspiration for future operatives who might find themselves in similar impossible situations. Sometimes the best response to being hunted was to become the hunter, and sometimes the most effective escape was through the enemy's own positions. The mission had ended with complete success, but Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve her country's interests. The war in Afghanistan would continue, and there would always be a need for operatives who could think tactically under pressure and turn desperate situations into operational victories. She had proven once again that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all. It had appeared from their covered position. Sarah found herself weaving between obstacles while maintaining control of her prisoner, all while bullets cracked overhead and sparked off the concrete around them. The engineer moved quickly but deliberately, apparently understanding that his survival now depended on reaching the aircraft safely. One of the SEAL team members moved to assist Sarah with her prisoner, taking custody of the engineer while she provided additional security during the final approach to the helicopter. The professional handoff was smooth and efficient, demonstrating the kind of coordination that came from extensive training and real-world experience. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility lifting from her shoulders as military personnel took charge of the situation. The crew chief was gesturing frantically for them to board as enemy fire continued to intensify around the landing zone. Sarah could see impact marks appearing on the helicopter's armored fuselage, indicating that the enemy was now concentrating their fire on the aircraft itself. The pilot was undoubtedly eager to lift off before his machine sustained serious damage or casualties mounted among the extraction team. Sarah climbed aboard the helicopter while the SEALs maintained their security perimeter, suppressing enemy fire with precision shots that demonstrated their superior marksmanship and equipment. The engineer was quickly secured with flex cuffs and positioned between two team members who would ensure he couldn't attempt any last-minute escape or sabotage efforts during the flight to safety. As the helicopter began to lift off, Sarah looked down at the schoolyard where the operation had reached its climax. The enemy fighters were still firing from their positions in the surrounding buildings. But their shots were increasingly wild as the aircraft gained altitude and distance. What had begun as a carefully planned trap had ended with their leader in American custody and their operational structure in chaos. The flight to the forward operating base would take 20 minutes, during which Sarah would finally have an opportunity to process everything that had happened during the past few hours. She had walked into an obvious trap, turned the tables on her captors, and successfully completed a mission that everyone had assumed was doomed to failure. The engineer sat quietly across from her, his expression unreadable as he contemplated his future in American custody. The engineer maintained his silence as they moved through the network of alleys toward the extraction point, but Sarah could sense his mind working to evaluate escape opportunities. His cooperation was tactical rather than genuine, and she knew that he would attempt to break free if presented with any reasonable chance of success. Maintaining control of the situation would require constant vigilance until the SEALs could take custody of the prisoner. The sound of helicopter rotor blades in the distance indicated that the extraction team was approaching the area. Sarah checked her watch and realized that the timing would be extremely tight. They needed to reach the pickup zone before enemy forces could respond to the obvious presence of American military assets. The next 10 minutes would determine whether her audacious gamble would result in triumph or disaster. Sarah pressed the engineer forward as they navigated the final series of passages leading to the extraction point. Behind them, she could hear shouts and the sound of vehicles as enemy forces began to realize that something had gone wrong with their carefully planned operation. The hunters were about to discover that they had lost both their prey and their leader. Sarah checked her equipment and prepared to implement the most audacious phase of her escape plan. Rather than waiting for extraction, she was going to complete her original mission by capturing or eliminating the target who had set this elaborate trap. The enemy expected her to be running and hiding. Instead, she was going to attack their command structure. Moving through the bathhouse's ancient passages, Sarah positioned herself near a window that overlooked the main street where enemy vehicles were assembling. Through her scope, she could see the engineer himself standing beside a command vehicle, directing the search operations with obvious frustration. He was less than 200 meters away and completely unaware that his target was observing him. The shot would be challenging but not impossible with the equipment she carried. Sarah's rifle was a modified M4 carbine with a suppressor and high-quality optics, capable of accurate fire at the required range. The greater challenge would be escaping after taking the shot, since her muzzle flash would immediately reveal her position to the dozens of enemy operatives in the area. Sarah steadied her breathing and acquired her target through the scope. The engineer was clearly visible, animated as he gestured to his subordinates and pointed toward various buildings where he believed she might be hiding. In a few moments, he would climb back into his vehicle and drive away to a more secure location, taking with him the opportunity to complete the mission. The crosshairs settled on the target as Sarah's finger moved to the trigger. Years of training had prepared her for this moment, but the knowledge that she would immediately become the focus of every enemy weapon in the area added weight to the decision. Taking this shot would either end the operation successfully or ensure that she wouldn't survive to see the outcome. Time with unmistakable concern. Raven, we're seeing movement on satellite that suggests hostile activity in your area. Recommend immediate extraction to secondary rendezvous point. The secondary extraction point was a schoolyard 6 blocks away, but Sarah could see that the enemy had anticipated this possibility. Armed men were already moving to block the most direct routes to that location. Sarah's mind raced through her options as she watched the trap continue to tighten around her position. The Navy SEAL team that Webb had mentioned was still 30 minutes out by helicopter, assuming they could find a safe landing zone in an increasingly hostile area. Calling for immediate extraction would put the helicopter and its crew at risk, while staying in position would almost certainly result in her capture or death. The sound of engines starting drew her attention back to the street below. The pickup trucks were moving into final positions, while foot soldiers continued to infiltrate buildings throughout the area. Sarah realized that she had perhaps 10 minutes before the perimeter would be complete, and escape would become impossible. The enemy was being methodical and professional, taking time to ensure that no avenue of escape remained open. Her radio remained silent as she considered her next move. Webb was probably coordinating with military assets and trying to develop alternative extraction plans. But Sarah knew that help wouldn't arrive in time to prevent her from having to fight her way out. The question wasn't whether she would have to engage enemy forces. It was whether she could do so effectively enough to survive until reinforcements could arrive. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. She had spent years developing skills that made her nearly invisible in hostile territory, but now those very skills would be tested in the most direct way possible. The engineering had successfully turned her greatest strengths into potential weaknesses by creating a situation where stealth and misdirection might not be enough to ensure survival. Sarah checked her ammunition and equipment one final time as she prepared to implement an escape plan that was forming in her mind. The enemy expected her to either call for immediate extraction or attempt to hold her current position until help arrived. Instead, she was going to do something that they wouldn't anticipate. She was going to attack.